Angela Fay of Centerstone, and today I'm going to give you a quick overview of cultural studies and the ways it might apply to counseling. Let's begin with a working definition of cultural studies. Cultural studies is the study of how a society creates and shares meaning. So it looks at how we decided, perhaps, to use the word living room as opposed to parlor, or why it's polite to shake hands versus touch elbows, as we're more inclined to do these days. A lot of what we see as part of a natural and forever component of our lives is actually something that was created and shared throughout society at some point. For instance, did you know that originally in Europe, tablecloths were tucked into your collar and used as a napkin? And intentionally, at the end of a meal, the tablecloth was pulled up in the center and then hoisted off the table so you could carry the dishes to the sink. The use of a tablecloth has changed over time. So, how does the study of how a society creates and shares meaning apply to counseling? Well, on the micro level, it can allow us to look at how individuals make meaning about what is happening around them. On the meso level, it can teach us more about how families, neighborhoods, and smaller cultural groups can create and share meaning. For instance, in our family, there's an inside joke around the phrase "lamarunk," but other people won't know much about the shared meaning of lamarunk if you're not a member of our family. I bet your family has similar techniques. On the macro or cultural level, individual groups, societies as a whole, governments, all larger macro level cultural phenomenon create and share meaning. In fact, to go back to the mention of living rooms, the whole reason we call them a living room and not a parlor is because at the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. government had newly established the U.S. Health Department and learned about the detrimental effects of having funerals in a person's home. So they hired a man who worked for Harper's Bazaar magazine to create an advertising campaign to get people to start using funeral parlors. Part of that campaign was labeling your parlor your living room, as in, let's not host a ceremony for the dead in your house. So there's an example of how a society can create and share meaning on a macro level. Reality is a social construction, is the first tenet of cultural studies, as defined by a fellow from England named Tony Watkins. That's where I borrowed all this lovely information from. Well, at least the definition of cultural studies and the 5 principles. So, when we look at reality as a cultural construction, we realize that an individual or culture's interpretation of physical reality is culturally determined. Yes, reality exists. It's kind of hard to deny it. You can't exactly walk through a chair. But the fact that we call it a chair and not un silla, which is chair in Spanish, is culturally determined. And when and how we sit in said chair is also culturally determined. Hence, reality is a social construction. In counseling, it can be empowering to show clients their ability to shape and reframe their reality. We all know the power of a growth mindset or the power of positivity. These are examples of reshaping our view of reality. It is also powerful to recognize who or what is shaping their reality. For instance, for children who have an overpowering parent who is telling them they're lazy or unintelligent, that child may be empowered to know that they have the right to shape the reality they live in. Mentally speaking, of course. It also helps for clients to recognize that their view of reality is not universal. There are very few things that are universal about human beings. But a lot of times we assume that our view of reality is shared by everybody. It's because most of the people in our own reality share our reality. But in actuality, people from different cultural groups, different of all kinds, gender, class, ethnicity, religion, see reality very differently. The next tenet of cultural studies is that identity is a social construction. An individual's identity is influenced by social norms, cultural expectations, and self-definition. Exploring this with clients can help them maximize their ability to self-define. It also helps them understand the influence of family, friends, and societies on their sense of self. These two tenets combine together by helping us understand how sometimes we can construct an identity for someone based on their cultural background that is not actually grounded in fact, but instead grounded on our perception of reality. So, are we fairly responding to the identity of another person, or are we making assumptions based on our view of reality? The third tenet of cultural studies is that society is marked by a struggle for power. Members of society are working actively to establish the parameters of reality and shape the identity of others. Depending on your own ideological view, your perception of this particular tenet of cultural studies can take all different views. For instance, the Black Lives Matter movement has been founded on the idea that society as a whole contains systemic racism, which makes it very difficult for African Americans to remain safe, to self-define, and to have equitable opportunity to all aspects of society. It would also suggest that those who hold the power over these things wish to retain that power and do so by disempowering others. So, in counseling, cultural groups in power would like to maintain and broaden their power. Cultural groups without power seek to distribute power. Social workers are dedicated to social justice as part of their call to action, the definition of their social role. Counselors need to recognize the degree to which this struggle negatively impacts their clients. Oftentimes, particularly if we are a counselor from a position of privilege, we may not recognize the degree to which society and the struggle to define reality within that society is negatively impacting our clients. So this raises the next question, which is sometimes hard for us to answer, which is, what role do we play in maintaining the struggle? What role do we play in maintaining the social structures which disempower some and empower others? The fourth tenet of cultural studies is that beliefs create an incomplete view of reality. Ideological belief systems can shape the way we perceive reality and cloud our view of certain aspects of reality. This is true politically, religiously, in terms of our beliefs about gender, in terms of our beliefs about masculinity versus femininity, about education. There are so many points in our lives where our own ideological beliefs lead us to have certain perceptions about the way things should or shouldn't be. Oftentimes, when we help clients recognize how their belief systems are shaping their view of self, reality, and others, they can then find new ways to see a fuller picture of the world in which they live, and how perhaps ideological beliefs are limiting their self-realization. I'd also like to point out there are a lot of positive things about belief systems. We all know that spiritual beliefs are very good at giving people positive views of themselves, their destiny, their community, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying belief equals bad. I'm saying belief equals incomplete. The fifth and final tenet of cultural studies is that language creates an identity for the sender and the receiver. This means that the language we use creates an identity for us and those we are speaking with. I know when I first started teaching, because my first career was as a professor, I would say something and my students would stare back at me. And I wondered, what does that glassy-eyed stare mean? One of my students got brave enough to say, "Was that in English?" And that's because I tended to use, as my mother would say, highfalutin words. For instance, when giving directions, I might have said, "Up ahead, the road bifurcates," versus "forks." Same meaning, different word. So, understanding how the language we use shapes the identity of our clients is extremely important. The way we talk about the world around us, the way we talk about them, the way we talk about ourselves, shapes how the client sees us and how we see the client. Helping clients understand how their language shapes the social perception of them is very useful. For instance, when a client comes to us because they're having great difficulty getting a job. Well, when they speak, they frequently use colloquialisms that not everyone understands, or they might swear a lot. Things that in certain professional contexts would make it difficult to get a job. Likewise, helping clients understand how the language they use constructs an identity for the important people in their lives. For instance, my dad's favorite name for me when I was a kid was Dingbat. I tried to point out to him that perhaps that was not the best nickname he could have chosen for my ego and self-acceptance or view of how he saw me. So these are the tenets of cultural studies. Now, let's look a little bit closer about some ways that cultural studies can help expand our own cultural understanding and the cultural understanding of others. Radical multiculturalism is a belief that to bring an end to discrimination, we could intentionally deconstruct the concept of the other by always looking at cultures and cultural actions from an emic perspective. Now, if you may be feeling like my students at this point and wondering, what does that mean? No worries, because the next slide will go over exactly that. What does that mean? So, to totally understand what I was saying about radical multiculturalism, you have to know two things. What is the other, in quotations, and what's emic? So let's take the first term. The other is the human tendency to see those who are not like us as the other, or an outsider with abnormal cultural beliefs. In other words, when we look at a culture or individuals from cultures that are not our own, we often have an us versus them perspective. Well, that's weird when we look at their cultural practices. But in reality, they may feel the very same way about us. For instance, historically, in China, it would be very odd to put all the different courses of a meal on the same plate. Also, when they use celery, they take out the toughest strands. So when they look at the way people from the United States eat, they're like, why do they have all their food on one plate? That seems kind of like they're hoarding food, which is kind of ironic considering the most common form of Chinese restaurant is a buffet. Interesting. As a side note, in Chinese restaurants in China, when they serve the dessert, it is usually orange slices. Fortune cookies were invented by a European-American restaurant owner in San Francisco in the early 1900s. On to emic. Emic means to view things from an insider perspective, to see a culture or cultural practice as members of that culture would. Now, basically, what this means in terms of radical multiculturalism is that if we want to bring an end to discrimination, which means acting upon discriminatory beliefs, we need to stop seeing people who are unlike us as the other and start seeing those people and their customs as they see themselves and their customs. This would allow us to use the wonderful skill of perspective taking to understand people from within their cultural beliefs. Thank you very much for joining me for this short introduction to cultural studies. If you have any questions, you can reach me at Alexandria LaFay at Centerstone, or dial my extension, which is 1996. Thank you so much for everything. Have a great day.